So welcome to the Comcast presentation. Just going through the team real quick. It was myself, Cyrus Shaughnessy, engagement lead, and then the rest of our team, who again, unfortunately, is testing. So the key questions that we kind of set out to answer with this project in general were, number one, how do customers value individual products and bundles that Comcast offers? Are the regional and product segments, and also how do those segments value things differently? So the data set we were given was mostly just a long history for the last 2 years of all purchases of Comcast packages, which include things like video, internet, and call, like phone and calling people. And so we were kind of exploring the intricacies with that. So just a quick overview. Also, unfortunately, most of these things are pretty confidential, so we had to limit a lot of the information, so it might be highly censored. Apologies if it's not the most exciting and you see a lot of X's. So the data came actually one of the most clean data sets I've ever seen. So it was beautiful. Most of the working we actually had to do was just in trying to make things more interpretable, since there were a lot of levels for things. So for instance, like video, internet packages, both had like 40 different levels or so. And so it was pretty difficult to interpret. So we just first binned those to make it more understandable, since a lot of the packages were very similar anyways. It would be like basic video and basic video plus some small perk. Moving into some data exploration, you can see just the distributions of various types of packages that were offered. So video tiers, which are just the different video package bins that we created. You can see there's a pretty clear distribution. Again, unfortunately, we can't show much of the details of this. Same thing with phone. And then these are the ranges of bundles. So the important thing to see here is just that there are 3 bundles that absolutely dominate all of Comcast sales, which is nice for interpretability's sake and things like that, but also makes it difficult for analysis, right, when there's very little variation. And so a lot of the insights are going to be based around those 3 main factors, because those niche bundles are, pretty selective and not offered that widely. So most of the analysis is going to end up following sort of those big bundles, and you can probably see those emerge. So then looking at some interesting things. So these are the various speed tiers that they offer versus revenue. Very clear distinction between it sort of at the beginning, since there are other packages. That's why like the lowest internet speed might seem like counterintuitive that's higher, but just like an interesting finding, and sort of a general trend that we see of, higher speeds means higher price. This was also interesting in that there seemed to be a really big distinction in the types of internet people were buying based on the internet they were actually, or the overall bundle they were doing. And so you can see a clear distinction on the right graph, where the bottom 4 are making up a much larger portion than they are in the first 2. So there definitely is some distinction between the types of specific package or like packages that people are buying, the specific items they're buying within each type of bundle. So for our overall methodology, once we actually started doing analysis, we started with some k-means clustering, which seems to be a common theme today. And then we used a random forest to try and get a little more of an insight and more of like an exploration of analysis. So get some insights of the effects initially. And then we finally just used linear modeling to give us really interpretable answers and very clear-cut sort of deliverable numbers that we could put values on for the items. So just going over the clusters. So the main clusters we found for 2 million, just for efficiency's sake, and also for data size out of the total size, which was very representative, was basically these 4 that came up. So it was mostly, again, based on the type of bundle people were buying. So video and internet was up there, along with technologists, traditionalists, who are, you can see what each one is buying, and then all in one. So considering most of the data we had was on like the packages and the bundles that people were buying, that's kind of what the clusters came out as well. We were kind of limited in terms of customer level demographic data and things like that. So these segments weren't exactly the most exciting, but they were definitely interesting and coincided with what Comcast had on their side in terms of segments, which was always good to see that we're kind of reaffirming what people have found already. And again, you can see that there are pretty big differences in the clusters in terms of how, so left to right, you can see this is the like the revenue distribution. So there's definitely a clear break between the 4 levels. And then you can also see the colors delineate the region they're in. So what part of the US, which is also pretty distinct, a little more difficult to interpret since there's so many colors, but you can definitely see some overall trends. So now just going over random forest, in case you're not familiar, basically just binning a bunch of decision trees, which are individual decisions into a big voting aggregate, which then makes a final prediction. However, instead of using ours mostly for prediction, we were actually using it for interpretation of effects. So just to get an idea of model effects before we decided on a final linear model. And so unfortunately, we can't show most of the effects, but we found incredibly high R squared, which is always nice to see. And we got a breakdown and saw that sort of the same features are really important across all the different areas and across all metrics. So that was good to see. And then this was really interesting. So one member of our team did this new kind of package, a new method of trying to get the interpretable effects from random forests, which is usually a pretty tough thing to do since it's a pretty high level method. And so you can actually see the effects of each thing pushing the price, the revenue up and down from the base price in the middle. So the red means it's pushing it more positively, the blue means it's pushing it more negatively. And then on the bottom left, you can see an overall distribution of those sort of effects for each individual feature, which is really interesting. So you can actually see how it was affecting each individual decision tree and each individual random forest, and like group those all together and sort of get like this overall view of what's going on. And so just some examples of how that kind of changes by region to region. You can see that there's definitely some delineation between this and this. So there's definitely the effects are kind of varying depending on the region, which is nice to see, giving us a good idea that we should explore that further. And then again, this is just another sort of version of seeing individually what one feature sort of how it varied. It's kind of difficult to interpret without any of the numbers or anything, but you can just see that there's a large difference in the effects depending on the feature. So then finally, to actually make it interpretable, since that was sort of the main concern for Comcast, which limits our modeling kind of. So we just went with a pretty standard linear model.
Thanks, Cyrus.
Yeah.
Sorry for joining.
Hi, Ashley.
Hello.
Ashley's test is done.
I apologize. I had a mandatory meeting, but I am here and so happy to be joining you guys today. I'm Ashley, senior analyst on the project, and I want to thank Cyrus for taking the lead on the first couple of slides. I guess the big question our group was trying to answer was, hey, we did lasso, PCA, random forest, various other unsupervised learning techniques, but how can we create results that are actually useful for our Comcast? And how can they apply these results to figure out the prices of their current products? And how does that vary by region? And maybe what's the part worth that they're putting on each of their individual offerings? And how should that be adjusted based on what we're seeing in the data? So sadly, as I'm sure Cyrus has mentioned, we can't actually provide you with the numbers. But the way that this model works is basically we used feature selection based on our findings from the various regression techniques that we used beforehand to basically simplify it down into a linear model that was first trained by Lasso. So the green bar actually is the base price that you would see for the entire model. And you actually add each of the prices that you see, the red bars, the orange bars, and each of those little bars correlates to a different product offering of Comcast and the actual worth that it has within like the customer's willingness to pay for that product. So on the next slide, you'll actually see that this is how the model works, is the green bar would be the base, and then you would add each little bar on top of each other to get the total willingness to pay for the customer. So Comcast wasn't just interested in, hey, how do our customers value the products, but they were interested in how do specific customers value different products, and like what's the willingness to pay by region and what insights can we draw from that. So we actually made this model for every single region, and we found some pretty stark differences, but on the whole, the customer's willingness to pay was very similar. So we see that in every region, it's a little bit different, but we can't actually tell you the coefficients. But basically what we were able to figure out from this is that competition was higher in certain regions than others. Customers were willing to pay for things like video or phone more in other regions. And overall, like customer willingness to pay, and you can see with the base price in the West, is just higher in general. So I wish we were able to show you the actual numbers so you could visualize this a little bit better. But in our presentation to Comcast, we were able to identify basically, hey, what products can you upsell? Why aren't, and say things like, why aren't customers in the West buying this speed tier, or why aren't they doing these certain things? And yeah. And then here's the base price. So you can see the willingness to pay really is different by region in magnitude. And then you see also, as I mentioned before, the customers in the Central and West are willing to pay more for digital video. So you can kind of see the difference. and also the competition is definitely different based on the bars actually represent how much more would a customer be willing to pay for Comcast service versus their competitors. So a high bar is actually good because that means that customers are willing to pay that much more for a Comcast product offering. And then if we go along, we also did this for promotions. You see that certain promotions have a much larger effect in different regions, with the bar actually indicating that Comcast promotions are even more effective in that region. And then I think for speed tier, it's pretty good news because there's a high correlation between as speed tier goes up, we also see that the customer's willingness to pay goes up, which is good because that means that they're roughly pricing their offerings correct, because that's what we'd expect to see if the willingness to pay was already estimated correctly. And then for video tier, we found pretty consistent results by region. Obviously, the West was a little bit lower just because there's such a demand for video in that region. Yeah. And then you want to take the key findings, Cyrus?
Yeah, sure. So again, this is going to be pretty unimpactful, unfortunately, but we found just specifically a lot of features and values and things that specifically you could see pretty good impacts just from specific things, which again, we can't really share. We also saw, like once we dig into it, some more detailed descriptions of what products and bundles each of these segments were actually buying. And then from that, we had some recommendations based on each segment of how they could increase revenue, how they could upsell, how they could segment and analyze those groups further. Again, a lot of these things are pretty confidential. So our key takeaways, a lot of X's you'll see here, unfortunately. But the point is we did find some pretty significant effects from what was not the most robust and varied data. And so I feel like it was pretty exciting to be able to find a lot of these very specific and key takeaway insights just from using models that aren't exactly, triple neural network things, and just from doing some of these like basic analyses that we get. So yeah, and we're ready for any questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Cyrus. I see one question here. We have about 2 minutes to go, so I think we're good on time. Just a few questions regarding what linear model was used, how did you deduce willingness to pay, and what regression methods were used for future selection. I don't know if Cyrus, Ashley, whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, sure. So, oh, you want to, Ashley? Good.
I will take the first one. So what linear model was used? So the actual model that we provided to Comcast was a regular linear regression model, but before that was just for interpretability. But the way that we actually found which coefficients to use in our model was a combination of random forest, PCA, and lasso regressions. So essentially what that means is we were able to identify, hey, this is what's important in the linear regression model, and remove everything that wasn't statistically significant. And that kind of just helped us to have a very strong linear model with an R squared of about 86% of the correlation being explained in the model. And then Cyrus, do you want to take, and then how was the willingness to pay deduced? Basically what happened was we had multiple levels of the actual price the customer was paying. And we actually had this over a 3-year time span. So we were able to say like how much are customers actually paying versus how is Comcast pricing the offerings? So comparing the price that they're paying, and like we see customers are actively buying that product versus how they're individually pricing each offering. We were able to say, take that difference, and then that was the dependent variable of the willingness to pay. I will add that there are limitations to the methodology that we used because we only had data from Comcast's current customers. So in an ideal scenario, we'd actually do an entire market analysis where we could compare like even customers that Comcast didn't acquire. And then Cyrus, do you want to take what regression methods were used for features? Oh, I guess that one.
I mean, yeah, it was pretty straightforward in terms of the main thing we used was lasso to actually reduce the features down because we did have a ton, and we also used that to help in binning and things like that. And also just kind of touching on the whole willingness to pay thing again. So yeah, like Ashley was saying, the main thing was that it wasn't exactly willingness to pay for a new customer. It was more of what value were they placing on the individual products in a bundle. So if they have internet and video, how much do customers actually are they willing to pay for the video and how much for the internet individually, which a lot of the times didn't line up with Comcast's kind of internal pricing model, which was very interesting to see.